Thank you, Casper, and thank you everyone for the invitation. Jan as well, who should be here soon. This is joint work with Andrew Oswald, who joins us online. And Andrew and I have been working on this for the last several months, and it'd be great to get your feedback as well. So we know the recent Nobel Prize winner in medicine. What's interesting here is that she was demoted several times and had a salary cut by the University of Pennsylvania. Now the story gets better. Actually, she was demoted 4 times at her job. But where the emotions come into play is that recently the University of Pennsylvania threw a party and they were very happy about it. And a lot of the academics were saying, hey, you should apologize to her as well. So there's sort of, on a very broad scale, emotions and demotions, but what me and Andrew do here is a little bit more specific. And in particular, we want to test how subjective feelings, so worker feelings, or emotions, and objective measures of their autonomy at work and seniority, how this evolves or varies over their working lifespan. So here we want to look at how people feel in their workplace about how much autonomy they have, but also want to see if there's any objective measures and how this varies. Now, interestingly, there's been pretty much no research on this so far. One difficulty is the data, right? So now, one underlying question we have there is, following this, are demotions and sidelining rare? So if you look at all the economic sort of literature, it's all about progression and sort of moving upwards. Demotions barely get mentioned in the sort of classic labor economics textbooks. But if you look at some sort of surveys of human resource managers and consulting firms around the world, this one in the US, they found that about 46% or half of the companies that were surveyed, they've demoted workers. So it seems to be occurring. And this notion of demoting could be literal, where you get sort of, your rank goes down, but also could be quiet or hidden, where you get sidelined, pushed to the sides, where you don't have as much authority in the workplace as you do. So how can we test this? That's a question. So in economics, especially labor economics, it's all about forward progression and promotions, but it's based on pretty much zero to very little empirical research. And it seems to have started by this paper by Baker and colleagues, published in 1994 in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And they use 20 years of data, but only one company, a railway company in the US, and they find that demotions are quite rare. So all the sort of economic theorists and people working on conceptual models in economics, they took this empirical evidence and then built their models around, and here's just a sample of a few, where pretty much they quote that demotions are rare. There's a few papers here. Pretty much up to now, and the last one is Bose and Lang, saying, our model explains several empirical regularities, such as rare demotions. But to answer this question, we really need to look at the empirical evidence. And so this is what Andrew and I do this study. Is this really an empirical, is this picture an empirically accurate one? Now, finding longitudinal data that follows the same set of workers as they grow older through time is very hard, especially where you have questions about their feelings about their autonomy, self-reported sort of autonomy at work. Now, one data set we have access to is the HILDA Survey, which most of you here have probably used and heard about. And here we have data from 17 waves from 2002 to 2018, around 18,000 workers. And we sort of look at the age from 18 to 65, and we look at the working hours from 20 hours per week to 120. And overall we have about just over 100,000 observations. And that's sort of one very rare longitudinal data set that has these questions about autonomy. Here are the questions on autonomy that we analyze, and pretty much similar to any sort of well-being question that we're familiar with. How strongly do you agree or disagree from 1 to 7? And there's these 3 questions here. I have a lot of freedom to decide how I do my own work, when I do my own work, and what happens in my job. So here we have the how, when, and what. We take the responses to these and we average them to get the sort of average response for each individual to form some sort of composite measure of autonomy. And before I show you what we find, what do you expect this longitudinal relationship to look like in terms of job autonomy and age? So imagine sort of a career or a lifespan at work. How does this evolve? Is it flat? Does it monotonically increase, or is there some non-linear shape? Flat, yeah. And it's important to emphasize here that every result I'm going to show you, it estimates a fixed effects equation at the individual level, where here we're pretty much analyzing the aging effect, so the net effect of aging on autonomy. So the same workers are followed through time, close to 2 decades, and we see what happens every year in terms of their autonomy. In the equations, we're just going to control for survey year dummies and industry vertical dummies. You can include everything else, but a lot of it is in a way endogenous. But including anything else you like, we still get the same patterns on age. And this is what we find here. So this is what we find for longitudinal feelings or self-reported feelings of job autonomy in the HILDA. We see that, so on the vertical, we're plotting the age band dummy coefficients, so the changes in job autonomy, and on the horizontal, we have the age group. We see that there's a strong increase in autonomy up to about midlife, age 40 to 45, and then there's a steep decline all the way for the next 20 years, from age 40 to 65. Now, this is really different than what we expect in terms of this progression where you think that autonomy should be increasing all the time. Now, in terms of the magnitudes, we see that at the peak in the middle, it's just below 0.6, and then that declines to close to 0. So that decline is quite strong. And in terms of, if you look at the relative magnitudes, it's about half of the standard deviation in terms of the raw data on autonomy. In that case, and in terms of other factors, if you estimate a simple cross-sectional regression with autonomy and a bunch of other factors, the gender dummy has a 0.3 coefficient, so males tend to have more autonomy. So it seems to be quite a sizable effect we have here. So this is sort of self-reported feelings or emotions about autonomy as the workers age. Something fundamental seems to be happening after the midlife where they're just reporting low levels of autonomy. We want to understand why. Is this a really fundamental problem in the modern labour market? This is by gender. The darker bars are for men, the lighter for women. You see again the similar shape, except that if you look at the erosion of job autonomy since sort of midlife, it seems to erode a bit quicker for men than women in this case. But it still holds for both men and women. So is this telling us something really fundamental that we've missed out in terms of what's happening in the modern labour market? Now you might say, okay, these are self-reported measures. It could be that perhaps older workers, and there's literature showing that older workers tend to have high expectations or they prefer jobs with high autonomy, and maybe they're just sort of setting a high bar at the top end of the age group. So that's why when they don't achieve that, they're sort of reporting low levels. So let's go to some more objective measures. And we also have data on objective measures about everything about their job, sort of the features. And one is whether you have the word manager in your job title. So this is estimating on the vertical, we have the change in the probability. So the probability that you have the word manager in your job title, again, across the different age bands. And we see that the probability you have the manager word title peaks in, again, around the midlife, age 40 to 45, and then it deteriorates very quickly. So it follows the same shape as the loss in autonomy here. But again, this is where someone gives you the manager title at work. We also have a group of other objective and neo-objective measures of job autonomy. So the first one is the manager and the job title. We also find exactly the same hill shape in whether you supervise others in the workplace. So this is another proxy how much autonomy you have in your workplace, whether you can decide when to take a break, and also whether you have flexible start and finish times, whether you can go to work and leave whenever you like. All of these measures, if you use them as the left-hand side variables or outcome variables, they tend to follow this hump shape over the life cycle.
Can I just ask a quick one about job autonomy as it's measured, is that a subjective assessment of your own job autonomy directly? Because I know sometimes in some surveys you might put in, can decide when to take a break into...
So that's a good point. So I would say the first two here are objective, right? The first two. The 3 and 4, you would say they're near objective. So you can argue they're a little bit subjective, the 3 and 4, but I would call them near objective. That's what we call them in the paper. Yeah. But the first one I showed you, it's purely perceived autonomy, right? The one where it's self-reported.
Okay.
Yeah. So these are, again, some objective and near objective measures. Now, there's actually another hump shape that's very famous, and I think most of us in grad school have estimated this equation by Jacob Mincer in the labour market, and he estimates earnings or wages as a function of experience and experience squared, and he finds this hump shape. Now, it's very hard to conceptualize this kind of empirical finding with the models we see in economic theory, where it's just about promotions. Now, we do the same here, and again, this is hourly wages on the left-hand side. Again, in a fixed effects equation, following the same workers over their working lifespan with just year dummies and industry dummies. And again, we find the same pattern. Now, this pattern, we found it in the Australian data. There's a nice paper also using Norwegian data that finds the same pattern. But it's very hard to explain what gives us this shape, which Mincer showed us in the 1970s. This erosion of job autonomy can perhaps explain that turning point in earnings as well. Now, that's the Australian data, which follows for about 2 decades. We also tried to find some other longitudinal data that captures people's feelings about autonomy and their job. There's one other one. This is the ELSA Survey, the English Longitudinal Study of Aging. Some of you may have used this. Now, what's interesting here enough to highlight is that they only look at older group of individuals or population, starting at 50 years old. So they don't collect data on anyone below the age of 50. So in our case here, 50 is going to be the starting point, so we cannot have the whole life cycle. We just want to see what happens to perceived autonomy from age 50 to 65. And here we have about 6,000 workers, again, followed each year from 2004 to 2018, and about close to 15,000 observations. Now here the question is a little bit reversed. So the graph I'm going to show you is going to be a little different because it's reverse coded. So here it says, do you strongly agree or disagree from 1 to 4, whether the respondent feels they have little freedom to decide how they do the work. So if you strongly agree, you're sort of you're at the bottom end of autonomy. As we increase from 1 to 4, we're getting more autonomy. Does that make sense? Yeah. So here, if we see negative coefficients, that means the autonomy is decreasing. And again, if we estimate our fixed effects job autonomy equation with survey year dummies and some industry-related dummies, we see again there's all of these coefficients or bars are in the negative quadrant, and comparing to the reference group, which is 50 to 53 years, all of these are less or more negative. So again, there seems to be some reduction in job autonomy from age 50 to 65 compared to the baseline, right? So it gives us the same shape, but we can't say much about the life cycle, again, because the data only starts at 50 years of age. But nicely here as well, we also have some objective measures that are correlated with autonomy. And this is a question whether you directly supervise other people in your workplace. And again, this is the probability, estimated probability, or the change in the probability that you're a supervisor at work. And we see as we go into the older age bands, this probability is much less or more negative than compared to the baseline. So pretty much as you get older, the less likely you are to supervise others in the work. Again, looking from 50 to 65. So again, this data confirms, it complements the HILDA survey data, which is a little bit more richer in that case. Now, what can really be explaining this? So we did a number of checks and robustness tests to see what could be driving this hill shape and especially this decline or erosion in job autonomy. One thing could be that a worker could be switching jobs, right? And then as I switch my job in that year, I could be at the sort of lower end of the hierarchy in the new company, and that I could be reporting lower autonomy levels. Now we test this, and we find that, Andrew and I find this not to be the main explanation. There is some employer-to-employer switching. About 20% pretty much of the workers do that, but it cannot explain what we find. So it just accounts for some of the observed decrease in job autonomy, and we do this pretty much looking at workers who are in that older age group from 50 to 65, and whether they change jobs and experience a drop in autonomy in the same year. So most of the results are within the same employer. They are losing this autonomy within the same sort of company, more or less. Now another question is, could this hump shape stem from some kind of unusual form of attrition where we're filling the survey, but the older respondents are just dropping out, and then we're not getting these sort of, those people with high autonomy are dropping out and hence not reporting it. We actually find the opposite. If you are high autonomy today, so if you're entering in the sort of top end of the scale, you're much more likely to stay in the survey the next period. So this is not some unusual asymmetric attrition. Some people might also say, what about early retirement? Could that be, and then people are just not having high levels of autonomy? Well, we see the drop starts in midlife, age 40, 45. So that's intuitively, that doesn't really make sense in terms of retirement. Another one, this is Jeff Bezos, by the way, from 98 to 2017. So quite a bit of a change. So it could be that, is this something new, a new phenomenon in society where recently something's happening where the autonomy is just dropping off all the workers? So what we do there, because we have the data for about almost 17 years, we cut the data in small pieces or years, and we look at the balance panels where the same workers are being tracked through that period. And we see that if you look at the data, say early 2000s or 2010, 2015, it's all the same. The hump shape is still there. So it's not a new phenomenon that we're actually finding. Another question could be, how does this vary across the private sector, the public sector, and not-for-profit sector? And the HILDA has this nice information in terms of what kind of organization you work for. We pretty much find that in the private sector, the sharpness of this curve or the prevalence is the strongest in the private sector. So these kinds of demotions, whether they are literal or de facto, they happen most in the private sector. In the public sector, it's still there, but it's not as sharp, this sort of hump shape. But if you look for the non-profit sector, like charities, it does not exist at all. So it's not there. And I'll talk about industries as well, but let me just, now one sort of, a couple of categories where we don't find the hill shape is that if you're a manager your whole life, so imagine when you're a youth, you're a manager in a company, and as you grow older, you're still a manager, these people don't experience this hump shape in autonomy. So in a way, these are perhaps specially skilled individuals where we find that their perceived autonomy that they're reporting seems to increase in a very strong monotonic way. So just to clarify, this is a manager who's been a manager their whole life telling us how they feel in terms of their autonomy. The objective measure, whether you are a manager, has a hump shape. So when someone's giving you a manager title, probability of being a manager, that has a hump shape over your lifespan. But if you're a manager your whole life and telling us how you feel, it increases monotonically in terms of your autonomy. And probably most of you have seen this movie, right, with, she does a great job. Okay, and also if we look at by industry, I'm just going to add this extra, out of the 19 industries that we analyze, we can look at whether this hump shape of self-reported autonomy is still there. In about 4 or 5, it doesn't exist. One of them is within the education sector, so pretty much us here, right? We don't experience that on average. Also, if you're a professional or technical individual, that doesn't seem to be the case. But in some others, we just don't have enough statistical precision to show, because we look at industries and then when you include a sort of a fixed effects equation, it's very hard for these numbers to have a statistical precision. Now, just to conclude, so what we find is a hidden over-the-hill phenomena in the labour market. which has not been shown or studied before. And what's interesting as well is that, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, is that there's barely any study that looks at autonomy over the lifespan. There's some that look for sort of cross-sections about why is autonomy important, but sort of looking at what happens through our lifespan, there's barely any studies here. And we find that the typical worker in our data reaches a midlife plateau of autonomy and of job seniority. Now, this is a bit of a paradox as well, because if we look at all the data on subjective well-being, we find the famous U-shape. Andrew's done a lot of work on this, and many of you here have looked at this as well. We see that in midlife we reach sort of some minimum point in terms of our self-reported happiness. Whereas here we find that autonomy peaks in midlife. So it's a bit of paradoxical what's going on here as well. So Labour economists have obsessed about promotions and pretty much forgotten about demotions. And demotion seems to be real based on the data we have here. And different forms of the demotions seem to be taking place, where one is where the workers are not leaving their company or employer. They're still sitting there, but they seem to be quietly sidelined, not sacked. So here's a nice image where, if you can see, there's a team of workers working on a project, but he's an older worker who's been pushed to the sidelines, and if you can see on the sign, it says dinosaur at work. So this is implying that they're at the sort of older age group. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and we can have a discussion. Thank you.